Okay, so I am now recording, and also I've put captions on, which I presume show up on other people's screens if that's useful. Let me just share my slides. Okay, which should now have popped up on your screens. So as you can see, the purpose or the main thrust of the call today, we're going to talk a little bit about the recent IETF meeting in Montreal. It seems like a long time ago, it was only a couple of weeks ago, but so quite busy last week. So yes, it already seems like a distant memory. But we'll talk about that for a bit, and then time permitting, a few other bits and pieces as well as per normal. And since there are a few people on the call who were also there, what I propose to do is I'll pull out principally one, possibly two things on some days that I thought were highlights. So I'm being deliberately quite targeted, but hopefully that will leave space for others to call out anything that they feel I overlooked. You don't have to be bored listening to my voice for the duration. So just a reminder, the meeting itself, the hackathon was on the 1st and 2nd of the month, and then the meeting ran through from, mainly the Monday, the 3rd to the 7th, but with some content also on the Sunday, the 2nd, particularly for new participants. It was based in the Fairmont Queen Elizabeth Hotel in Montreal. And pretty much all the recordings are now available, and a good percentage of meeting notes, although there are still some to be added. I think pretty much all of the slides will be accessible if that's useful to you. In total, as you see in the bottom of the screen, just under 1,800 people registered, just under 1,000 of them on site, and just over 800 remotely. And for comparison, the previous meeting in Madrid, slightly fewer people in total, but rather more, about 130 more on site and rather less remote. So it didn't feel maybe quite so busy, but it was still a decent number on site in Montreal as per Madrid, which is always good. Makes for a more interesting meeting. And this was a breakdown that was given midweek. So at that point, there were only 751 registrations. So a few more, I guess, mainly remote registrations sort of kicked in before the end of the week. I'm not going to go through all that, but you can see some of the breakdown there. Probably most usefully, over 500 registered for the hackathon at the weekend. And that did seem pretty well attended. Maybe slightly less energy than in Madrid, but still a good number of participants in that. And in terms of where they came from, as you can see, and again, I've lifted this from the report that was given at the plenary on Wednesday, halfway through the meeting. At that point, people from 64 countries, which is, I think, fairly typical, thereabouts, about 40% from the US, just under 10% from Canada, then Germany, the UK, and China, and then others in decreasing representation from there. But a pretty decent sort of spread overall, albeit somewhat sort of US centric, which is not really surprising given proximity to the US. Okay, so as I said, what I'm going to do is just going to walk through the agenda. See comments about the Mercator projection. Yeah, I'm not going to chat. A good point, but useful as a just as an abemoir perhaps, but yes, noted. No, it's not geographically accurate. Right, in terms of walking through this, and as I say, I'm just going to walk through the agenda. First, I go through the main agenda, and then I'll sort of call out a few comments from the side meetings. And I'm just going to sort of do that, as I say, very selectively, with maybe one, possibly two things called out each day. So as I go through this, if you were there either in person or remotely and want to add to it, feel free to do so. Just jump in as appropriate. So anyway, with that in mind, on the Sunday, as always, the IEPG took place between 10 and 12, alongside the new participant sessions. So that's, if you like, it's not part of the IETF meeting, but always takes place on the Sunday. Anyway, had a series of presentations. One I thought was particularly interesting. Jeff Houston from APNIC had a presentation titled Local Route Plus Plus, and talked to a topic that he's addressed on this call previously, and I've summarised that by sort of very selectively calling out or cutting a couple of things from his sort of slide set, which is effectively his suggestion: make a prefetch of the root zone as a default action for all recursive resolvers, and then fall back to incremental queries only when or if the prefetch fails. So that was really his proposition from the presentation, and that was really to try and reduce the volume of traffic to the root zone. Was part of it, and simultaneously, as you can see with the bullet points under the Y, so it give improved performance, because if you don't have to go back to the root zone so much, then you should get improved resolution speed and improved privacy as well. So, but if you go to the recordings, as I say, all the recordings should be up and accessible by clicking through on the meeting agenda. Then I thought that was a point well made, and I have a lot of sympathy with his proposition, which I know has also been presented recently at RIPE and possibly DNS OARC as well, not necessarily by Jeff in every case. Okay, and then rolling through to Monday, we had a dispatch session first thing on Monday, which had a number of presentations, including those in red at the top of the screen. There were, I think, 3 or 4 others, but those ones I thought were especially interesting. And of those, Jim Mosley, who many of you will know from Infoblox, previously from Nominet, who's does join this call from time to time. I'm just looking at the attendee list. He's not here at the moment. He presented on the idea of an AI agent sort of protocol to help with the discovery of AI agents, inevitably using the DNS to avoid the need for creating some sort of new system. So I thought that was quite interesting, with the provisional name of Band-Aid, which stood for something I can't for the life of me remember what it was, but I thought it was quite creative, and kicked off a lot of comments in the chat, mainly focused on Johnson & Johnson and whether it was whether their trademark would stretch, no pun intended, into the internet space. But notwithstanding that, it seemed to get some degree of interest with the outcome, that it was dispatched towards a BOF session at a future meeting. So that was a successful outcome for him. And then similarly, Gianpaolo Scaloni from Vodafone gave a presentation on something called a client-facing relay. The idea being, before, if you're using a protocol like ECH, before you connect to the CDN, you obfuscate the source identity, so that the CDN doesn't effectively end up gaining an enormous amount of intelligence from all of the connections that go to it. It's not dependent on ECH being enabled, I don't believe. I think the idea could well stand up in its own right, but it was sort of position it as a complement potentially to ECH, given that's intended to give privacy to an observer from an observer on the network. This will give privacy from sort of data collection by the sort of target server in this case. So again, pretty well received, and Gianpaolo got his desired outcome in the short term, which was dispatched to a mailing list for further discussion of the idea. The other thing I mentioned on Monday, so this would be one where I will pick up two sessions, was the HRPC, the Human Rights Protocol Considerations Research Group, which had again several presentations, but the sort of two main presentations rather. One was called "The Locknet: How China Controls Its Internet and Why It Matters," and the second one was "The Great Firewall Export." So at first light, it looked like they were a matched pair of presentations. One about the implementation, and one about how it was being exported from China elsewhere. In reality, that wasn't quite the case. So the Locknet presentation I thought was pretty interesting. It went beyond just the sort of technical aspects and sort of talked about some of the societal and related aspects of the overall system, which is quite interesting. I think it was a guy from Amnesty International, if I remember rightly, that gave the presentation. So it was not overly technical. But then, if you like, the second presentation focused on the implementation of a sort of surveillance-centered system in Pakistan. And whilst some components, I think mainly hardware, was sourced from Huawei in China, actually a lot of the capability was sourced from other companies, including from the USA and from France. So it wasn't really about the Great Firewall Export, unless you interpret it as simply the concept as opposed to the actual implementation of the system in China. So again, interesting presentation, but it was not quite as advertised in the title, in my opinion. But I will plough on, by the way, unless anyone does jump in to interrupt me with anything you think I've overlooked. So if, as we scroll through, do sort of jump in as appropriate. But if not, on Tuesday, the highlight for me was the decentralization of the Internet Research Group, DNRG, which had again a number of presentations, one of which was measuring how measuring the consolidation of DNS and web hosting providers. And again, I pulled out some bullets from, I think this was a couple of slides which give the sort of essence of the findings, which were unsurprisingly, probably to many of us, that internet infrastructure is highly consolidated or concentrated, as you prefer. And they sort of used the example of Cloudflare and Amazon, each of which seem to host over 30% of popular domains. And 5 organisations in total control over 60% of the sort of top website hosting, and that went sort of well down the sort of top. I think that was the top million, if I recall, sites. And a lot of organisations rely, so a lot of domains rely on one organisation for their DNS. And obviously they rightly highlight the fact that this sort of raises resilience risks, as well as increasing the potential for censorship and control. So therefore, from a research point of view, that needs ongoing measurement and potentially steps to reduce the concentration. Although I don't think, from what I remember, suggested mitigations were really part of that presentation, because that's probably quite a hard a hard thing to do, but I suppose if you're at least measuring it and you're aware that it's an issue, then that's an important start. And then I also mentioned,
And Andrew,
yeah, sorry, yes, do come in.
this is Jeff here. God
Hi,
knows
Jeff.
why I'm up at this hour of the morning, but here I am. I always thought that this research group was economically naive and had made a set of value judgments that are completely unwarranted. Um, when you get a market which is internally self-disruptive, as the internet, largely due to Moore's law continuously upsetting things, the incumbents have little choice but to aggregate up and basically buy out the competition in order to stay in their current position. That's the only defensive strategy they have. And in essence, this kind of centralization is inevitable and almost impossible to stop. And the other thing about that is the value judgment that it's bad is kind of weird because in so many ways, things are the price they are because of extraordinary economies of scale. So if you want to pay 10 times as much, then fine, have a whole bunch of competing, struggling, undercapitalized small businesses to try and do this service economy. But if you want to pay peanuts for extensive things like, oh my God, AI is so expensive and it can only be done by large people, then the whole thing is that centrality is an inevitable byproduct of that. And rather than saying, oh, it's all bad, reduced resilience, etc., the issue is that's a compromise that's made all over the world. And the upside is an extraordinary amount of technology is actually sent across to consumers at phenomenally low price simply because of the very economies of scale that's going on here. So I didn't bother going to that research group, the IETF week, because, it just seemed to me to be completely biased one way. And the initial consumptions, like I said, are just disconnected from reality. It's good to see the other side in these arguments, but in this case, I find it hard to give them credence.
Yeah, and to be fair, I do recall you making broadly those points or similar ones, Jeff. I think in Madrid, or
Yeah, I
possibly.
know. They really struck home, didn't they?
So I suppose. So, look, playing devil's advocate to your points for a moment. Yeah, notwithstanding the points which, yeah, absolutely right in terms of economics. Nevertheless, I think it's useful to measure the extent of the consolidation at least. To understand where and how it's consolidated, and then potentially to determine whether, and this will fall to, not to the sector but to others, whether any intervention is appropriate. But as I say, that's not a technology, so that's not an ITF or even IRTF thing. That would absolutely be more down to regulators to determine if the market power is such that intervention is required. Notwithstanding the economics would otherwise continue to drive it in that direction. And I think your point about consumer benefit, yeah, fair. Given that I can use a lot of AI, well, so-called AI tools. I'm an AI skeptic, but that's another discussion. Most of which are free, even though they're extraordinarily expensive to provide. So clearly, if I had to pay the economic cost of delivering those things, it would be a lot less than free, I would imagine. Um, so yeah,
So yes, the issues, as you wisely point out, are actually based around sovereignty, national security, self-sustainability in terms of digital technology, and the dependence societies have on foreign operators and the accountability of those operators inside your own, domestic economy, your own national boundaries. And those are very real concerns, and they were concerns in the industrial age, they're concerns today. But the other part of the myth of DNRG is that somehow the right technology will stop it is completely nonsense.
yeah,
The right technology will have nothing to do with this. It is, as you point out, more of a case of market regulation. But I've said enough. I just wanted to point out that, there were other views about DNRG than just the stuff that was going on inside the room.
yeah. I have to say it'd be quite fun to have a discussion with measures like what the economic interventions or the regulatory interventions might be, because I suspect that probably wouldn't land well with an IETF audience, but would probably be more relevant once you get the measures in place. But who knows? Maybe the IRTF might venture in that direction. Perhaps we should encourage Dirk to give them a nudge to do that. That'd be a more interesting discussion then.
I
It would
I
be.
think it goes into politics very quickly and out of the realm of the IETF or IRTF.
Yes, there is that risk as well. But yeah, anyway,
Do,
yes. Sorry, Jeff,
do
go
you
on.
think you can separate the two? And that's a very, very deep question in so many ways. But, I think many technology companies in Europe are kind of feeling, how do I bust into a market that is so solidly on the other side of the Atlantic in terms of control and its destiny? And that's, a technology and a political question at the same time. And if you want to take the focus of this group and look at the DNS market and assess a few years later, i.e., now, the success of DNS for EU in terms of making an impact on the dominance of American-based entities in the open DNS resolver market. It's a wonderful case study in terms of what can, nations or groups of nations do to increase their own resilience and self-sustainability, and what part of that territory is already lost. It just is globally interconnected and globally dependent on each other. But you're right, Andrew, it's a topic for a complete the hour-long discussion, but I think it's a very critical topic too.
Yeah, that's that. I think fair point. Um, yeah, that would definitely lead to an interesting DNRG if it ventured into that space. Okay, yeah, point well made. Right, and as I say, sorry, Michael, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, just real quick on the need for economic studies. I think one of the things that has kind of always disappointed me is in ICANN under the baseline registry agreement, section 2.15, ICANN has the ability to conduct economic surveys. And over the last 25 years they failed to. This right has been in the baseline agreement since 2012. So the need for fact-based decisions, I think, is important and potentially goes to the point that Jeff was making. Without facts, it's really dangerous to go forward with making policy. Thanks.
Okay, so maybe we should sort of pipe some of the DNRG sort of measurement outputs into ICANN amongst other places, if they've got that capability already in their articles. Okay, that's good to know. As I say, I will motor through.
I'll just come in and say that I agree that ICANN is the right place for those political discussions.
Okay, well, that'll be an interesting takeout from this call. Let's lobby ICANN as well as DNRG then. Right, Thursday. Sorry, Wednesday. Yeah, sort of two sessions jumped out at me. Firstly, AI preferences. This is, I'll crudely describe it very inaccurately, so apologies for anyone that's been following it closely, as a way of extending robots.txt to incorporate preferences around AI, sort of crawlers, search engines, etc. And as I say, if you've been following it more closely, you'll be aware that's a bad but gross simplification at best. They had two sessions, one on the Monday, one on the Wednesday. I chose to put it in here. I did sit in on them, and it felt to me like there was a lot of discussion across the two sessions, so across about 3 hours of chat, which also incorporated updates from, I think it was at least two interim meetings that were sort of hybrid, so face-to-face and with remote access, that have taken place since Madrid. And I think those were both 2-day meetings, although I wouldn't swear to that. So potentially pulling together 4.5 days worth of sort of discussion in total, it didn't seem to me that the group was making much headway, but was really going around in circles on a few things and partly, for whatever reason, they weren't getting into a discussion of some of the more fundamental issues. So I think unless and until they do that, then they're not going to, I don't believe, make substantive progress. And as an example, I think one of the fundamental issues that hasn't really been covered is a detailed discussion about whether it should be default opt-out or default opt-in if you're using these potential preference settings. And there are, I think, advocates with strong feelings on both sides of that debate, but the debate isn't really happening at the moment. So a lot of agenda time. So far, not rapid progress. And I think the original intent in the charter was that they would have a draft with the IESG by about now, and that clearly hasn't happened. And I think they've got a long way to go, based on what I saw in Montreal before they get to that point. The other one I'll just touch on briefly, the plenary. There was some discussion with the ISG about the way that appeals had been handled, largely. I mean, it was fairly understated criticism, but I think Stephen Farrell from Dublin University put it reasonably tactfully that they perhaps focused on the way a couple of appeals have been packaged to the AD and then to the ESG and finally to the IAB, rather than focusing on the substance of the appeal and looking past how the wording was expressed, and that probably had caused a lot more disruption to several mailing lists than would have otherwise been the case. But beyond that, the other main surprise, though, was there wasn't a lot of discussion about whether we should or shouldn't meet in San Francisco for IETF 127, which has been, I think it has consumed a lot of airtime for the last several plenaries, but it sort of felt like the community maybe has come to the conclusion that that's been done now. So aside from an impassioned sort of appeal's not the right word, encouragement from my good friend Arno Tedai Broadcom that people ought to go to Shenzhen and not avoid China. It was largely a more dull affair, but I suppose in a good way, with a lot less outrage than has been the case the last few meetings. So we got to dinner at a reasonably good time, which is always a positive thing. Again, I'll just continue to make progress unless anyone interrupts. On the Thursday, the sessional call out was the IAB Open, which covered a number of things. You'll see on the top of the screen there, top right of the screen. So there was an Etsy liaison update, which I've found relatively hard to engage with, because I think Diego Lopez from Telefonica assumed a fair amount of prior understanding of the mechanics of Etsy, so it wasn't as engaging as I felt it could have been, but that's obviously my bias coming across there. Mark Nottingham gave a good sort of summary of the recent age restrictions workshop, and then Raphael Somesi, who's again has been on this call previously, talked about Piracy Shield, the sort of relatively recent requirement for both IP and DNS blocking of sort of sports, pirated sports streaming content within Italy or to Italian consumers. I've sort of summarised some of the takeaways from the from Mark's discussion about the recent age restriction workshop. For those of you that weren't at the workshop itself, I know you may recall I was there, and I do recognise all of those things. So as he says, collaboration between the sort of technical policy technical and policy communities is important, and to build better understanding, and we won't. You can't just magically deliver safety purely by relying on technology. Although I'd probably add to that, but without technology, you won't have any meaningful safety. So it's an essential sort of part in my view. As I say, the other bullet points I recognise all of those are fine, but it was absent the notes from the workshop, which probably won't appear till the very end of this year, maybe early next year. Then it's quite useful. Yeah, I'd suggest again, if you were dipping into some of the presentations, if you either didn't make that one but were at the meeting, but alternatively if you didn't make the meeting at all, you might find that quite useful. And I note in the chat, thanks to I think Michael providing some links to some of the ICANN stuff that was sort of mentioned, and scanning down there. Yes, and unsurprising, Simon, that you fully understood Diego's presentation being an ETSI board member. It would be a bit surprising if you didn't. Yeah. As I said, I felt if you didn't have that understanding, it was harder to follow. I think it required there was quite a lot of assumed knowledge of the mechanics of ETSI. It could have been more useful for people who weren't previously familiar with it, but others' mileage might vary, as they say. Okay, scooting along through Thursday into Friday. A couple of interesting presentations. The first really interesting one, the Privacy Enhancements and Assessments Research Group, PEARG, had a number of really interesting presentations, again listed at the top of the slide. So Arturo, for example, sort of talked about sort of measuring and understanding ECH deployment, global trends and challenges. It felt like there was a really useful presentation lurking in there, but he had a very discursive style and seemed unconcerned about the time constraints of the slot he'd been given. And he also rather hilariously, where he presented a chart which had some key data on it, the title he put on the chart obscured a lot of the key data, which was unfortunate. But notwithstanding that, again, going back to our sort of consolidation discussion of earlier, pretty much all of the current deployment of ECH is by Cloudflare in terms of the sort of the hosted content. But within the presentation Arturo gave, I felt he'd misunderstood what had happened in Russia, because he talked about where there've been sort of attempts to sort of censor ECH hosted content in Russia, but that was because of a requirement or a mandate from the Russian regulator, who I think was untroubled by any collateral damage about covering uncontroversial hosted content. They just wanted all ECH content to be blocked. So I felt he hadn't fully understood what had happened in Russia when that took place about 12 months ago now, if I recall.
I kind of feel that ECH, Andrew, is between a rock and a hard place. Cloudflare have put forward a kind of, I don't know, slightly warped answer, if I could use that term, that if you trust Cloudflare, you can then do a secure handshake as long as you put Cloudflare in the secret, right? So
Yes.
you're not leaking an SNI except to Cloudflare. It's just kind of saying, I'm not leaking except to Google. You know, what's the definition of a leak if one of the biggest providers around gets the secret? The only other solution that is ever wandering around in the IETF was to actually put the encryption key inside the DNS and protect it with DNSSEC, which superficially sounds great until you realize that unless you get DNSSEC validation all the way down to the host on the stub resolver, the stuff is not secure. And I don't think we've ever found a reliable solution that pushes DNSSEC from the recursive all the way to the stub that A, doesn't take forever, and B, because of the packet size issue, doesn't have extraordinary reliability issues. And while Cloudflare has cut through that, the compromise is that you come up with a solution that is compromised at the outset, but to a more, well, I'd say restrained bunch of people, but Cloudflare aren't restrained. But, select your spy is kind of the terrible thing that we
Yes.
all face.
Yeah, exactly that. And there was some discussion in the chat, I think, during that presentation, and people seem to think it was better to have a monopoly spy than decentralized spying, to put it in those terms. I'm not sold on that. And to be honest, the solution put forward by Gianpaolo on sort of hiding the source before you deliver the query to the CDN is probably better from a privacy point of view. It has some other beneficial characteristics as well, to be fair. I suppose it has the same limitation as things like encrypted DNS, where you're basically protecting your information from a network observer, just assuming that you can trust the controlling party at the far end, which I think is slightly flawed. But there you are. And unless you go
Exactly.
to things like Oblivious, but then that has a bigger overhead in terms of performance. But I suppose that's broadly true. If you want so perfect privacy and security, then performance usually is the thing that takes a hit in the meantime.
Oblivious, if you're thinking about Apple's iCloud Data Relay, could variously be described, though, as an acute market failure. People don't want to pay. And I've been measuring the take-up, and it's unpleasant. It's very, very low.
That would be an interesting
fractions of a percent.
Hint, Jeff.
Okay.
Good data to surface on that, because I've not seen stats on that, so that will be really good.
I just put into the chat a place where there's a whole bunch of stats like that measured across the last 10 months.
Fantastic.
And the counts, like I said, just fractions of a percent in every single country.
Yeah.
Except Russia, where I can't see inside Russia.
Yes, that's a different discussion, I guess.
Totally.
That's really interesting to know that. Yeah, it's seriously, I think that would perhaps calling out some of those more obscure things and how well used or not they are would be quite interesting, just to compare and contrast. And then moving on to a more interesting in some ways discussion, we sort of nearly rounded off because the session overran pretty much. We're out of time because there was meant to be a presentation on from Gianpaolo as well, but I think he ended up with about 2 minutes at the end. The last presentation that took sort of time, to be fair, everything was running late, I think, after Arturo's presentation at the start. Mallory Nodal, who many of you will know, formerly of Article 19 and CDT, gave a presentation titled Chat Control, which in my view probably would have been better sort of included within HRPC, the sort of human rights protocol considerations. But it was referencing some of the proposed European legislation to sort of prevent the sharing of child sexual abuse material. But I'm somewhat biased, being a trustee of the Internet Watch Foundation, but I think that sort of Mallory was a few steps behind where the legislation currently is at. She's not a fan of client-side scanning, but some of the points that were made, I think, were less entirely accurate than they should have been. But because of pressures of time, it wasn't really possible to explore that properly within the meeting. But it would be useful to perhaps have a longer conversation about that. But as I say, it probably belongs in HRPC, which ironically Mallory co-chairs. So maybe that should reappear as a future meeting. But yeah, nevertheless, overall PEARG did have some good content, to be fair, albeit it could have been they could have been done better on the time management. And then to round off my IETF, I finished off at DM, Digital Emblems. So this is the idea of having an equivalent of a sort of Red Cross, Red Crescent type device to mark digital assets. And it felt like because it only came out of a BOF. I think it had its first proper working group meeting, I think was in Madrid. I think it was a BOF still at the previous meetings. So there is now a draft, but it seemed to me that it needed to be more focused, because I think there are about 13 use cases currently in the draft, so I think it could be tightened. But one of the things that they did was they sort of designated, well, effectively they didn't call it this, a design team to work through some of the more detailed points in the text to sharpen them somewhat. And rather hilariously, because a lot of people were making comments at the mic about not being lawyers, it turned out one of the people in the room was in fact a lawyer. So he is part of that sort of mini design team, which I think in the case of DM will be quite useful. So I'm hoping before the next meeting, with a bit of wordsmithing, it feels like that could make some decent progress, but probably just having a smaller group of people do the wording would be somewhat beneficial to get through at a bit more pace. Right, before I just briefly touch on the side meetings, let me pause there if anyone wants to jump in.
There was also the meeting on web.org Tuesday, I think it was.
I'm sure you're right. Will, did you want to expand on that at all?
Yeah, so we had a discussion about where we were with web.org. Obviously, this was the first IETF where there was a proper working group together, but we basically decided that maybe we needed to go back to the drawing board a bit, that we'd solutionized before we'd really discovered what the problem was. And I think, yeah, the sort of initial idea was that, people pretend to be Googlebot, and how do we have a standardized mechanism to sort of confirm that a bot is who it says it is? But it doesn't really address the issue of, bots taking more resources than they should, I guess. So it's quite more limited in scope, I think, than people wanted it to be. But then, the bot problem is a lot bigger than just what they're trying to tackle here, I think. And I think when they come to that realization, it might be a bit easier to kind of narrow the scope of this and work on it a little bit more.
Yeah, and dare I say it, not forgetting that the AI Pref working group is meant to solve the, are you allowed to crawl this site, and what can you do with the content of the site elements? So I think the intention is that they work they're a closely paired sort of set of working groups, ideally, that ought to complement each other. But yeah, okay, that's useful. Sounds like that might be in a position to make progress more rapidly than AI Pref, to be fair.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the ultimate problem is that if you start banning bots and they're that determined, they'll just pretend to be human. And so, in 5 years' time, they'll be saying, well, how do we validate all the users so that we can stop the bots? So it's a difficult one, really. And I don't really know which bit necessarily we should work on, but we'll have to see.
Yeah, good point. And I see Kurt was also asking about Deleg. Again, rather than boring you, let's just see if anyone else. I don't know.
I took the bait.
Yeah, go on then.
Deleg is both making progress and, I suppose, at a grander level, not really making any progress whatsoever. Um, well, when we got along with Deprive, looking at the way in which the DNS leaked information, the most sort of information rich segment that is leaking is the stub to recursive. And there have been some very good efforts and indeed successfully deployed. If you look at, bits and pieces of Cloudflare that actually do encryption with either HTTP, TLS or QUIC. And in isolated pockets, it kind of works. If you're talking to your own ISP, if you're trying to encrypt it, you've really got to ask yourself, why are you a customer of an ISP that you fundamentally distrust? And that's probably a better question than encryption. The bit that Deleg is actually trying really to address, which is encryption from the recursive to authoritative, only leaks meta information. In theory, the client is not directly visible. And I include in that client subnet because studies of client subnet show that the actual subnet carried is not the client's anyway, 90% of the time. And so why do you want to make such fundamental changes to the referral response, the delegation? This is not me, go look elsewhere. Trying to protect something that doesn't seem to need protecting at the cost of a technology transition that seems horrendously complex. I suspect that there's a bunch of people looking for something to do with their Wednesdays, and Deleg is a good place to fill it. I actually don't understand that it's actually working on a real problem or a real industry issue that gives it substance. And the work to date has kind of centered on the all singing, all dancing Texas Chainsaw Massacre of DNS resource records, the Service B record, which is sort of an omnibus answer when everyone was trying to put multiple resource records in a single response. Service B said, we'll just abuse the text record and overload it anyway and cram everything in. That's fine. But applying it to the referral response that's crazy. And about the only piece of sanity I heard all week came from Johan Ehrens, Sandstrom, I think he is today, which said, why don't you just use a normal referral response and cram whatever information you want about the way you get in touch with that authoritative server in the additional section as a synthetic Service B record and just leave it at that. And, in the crowds of folk desperate to work on Deleg, that got ignored, which is a pity because I think it was the most sane and rational thing I heard about Deleg all week.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Yeah, from what I recollect from a previous DNS OAuth meeting, I think the sort of most immediately interested people in Deleg were the CDNs because it gave some advantages for them. But yeah, it does add complexity. So yeah, fair points.
I actually don't see the CDN industry being. They've managed to make CNAME records bend to their evil purpose. They've made that idea of extracting a name out of someone else's realm and making themselves authoritative for just that name with almost surgical precision. And, no one's busy trying to go any further than that in the CDN space. And in some ways, it's hard to see what part of Deleg would do better than what CNAME for the CDNs is doing today. And I can't answer that. I frankly think that the CDNs are actually ideally suited to the purpose they're trying to put them to.
Interesting. I will get Ralph onto this call in a few weeks' time, probably, to as a proxy for the CDNs. Ralph Weber, for anyone who
Yes.
Who works for Akamai. I'm sure he wouldn't mind if I put that question to him as give a CDN centric perspective on why Deleg would be a good thing. That might be quite a useful to get his.
I would get up at 3 a.m. for that, Andrew.
Well, there'll be at least 3 of us on the call then in that case. Fine, no, seriously, I will ask Ralph because I can't. I'm slightly tired. Clearly, I can't off the top of my head recall his previous explanation why he felt it would be a good thing. So probably better to get it directly from him in this instance, as he was one of the sort of authors of the original draft. So yeah, let's do that. Okay. Right, let me just briefly, just keeping an eye on the time, touch on the side meetings. I'm going to very selfishly only mention a couple. Apologies for the quickly scrolling screens. So a lot of side meetings, including quite a few that had an AI theme, which inevitably suffered from overly full rooms largely. I will be very biased. The only two I'm going to mention, one I mentioned earlier, well, the topic earlier, so towards the far right of the screen. On the Wednesday, Gianpaolo as well as Wilman, both from Vodafone, hosted their side meeting on source privacy and decentralization beyond ECH. So that was their side meeting to expand on their thinking on the client-facing server to obfuscate the source before it the signal passed to the passed to a CDN. As I said earlier, I don't believe it's dependent on having ECH at the CDN. I think it's arguably a useful thing to do anyway. And I think part of their pitch was you could still, because you do all the obfuscation on the host network, then you can be compliant with local sort of legislative sort of requirements, which is more complex if you're trying to do that when the signal hits the CDN. So that was part of the benefit. And then just also equally briefly, the other one I mentioned, which was on the Tuesday, early evening, we had a side meeting on PARSEP. That's our proposal to develop a network protocol for parental controls. And didn't get any obvious sort of showstoppers to say why that shouldn't be done. Which I had a low bar in terms of what I thought success looked like, and I think we achieved that there, and we have quite a few people expressing interest in remaining involved in any subsequent activity in that space. So we'll be doing more on that in due course. Right, I'm just going to, in the interest of time, ignore the comments in the chat for a moment. I'm not going to go through the rest of this stuff in detail, just highlight that the slides which sort of talk to some of the other stuff, something not so much in the news headlines this week, but interesting analysis of DNS for use, which is quite pertinent, given sort of Jeff mentioned that earlier. So that's quite an interesting write-up by Mark Frederick Gomez, who I don't think had a particular sort of axe to grind on it. So he looked at it from the point of view of cybersecurity professionals, which I thought was pretty interesting. There's also a reminder from the European Commission of their planned multi-stakeholder forum on internet standards deployment, which they talked about at RIPE 90 and IETF 123, amongst other meetings. More details on the slide, and more so if you click on the link. As I say, I'll click over the rest of the stuff. There was also a few stories on sort of regional internet registries, which are sort of, again, because it's all internet governance related, I think are well worth following, but probably too complex to try and cover in the remaining couple of minutes. And I think I did, dare I say it, there was an interesting piece also, Jeff, as you're on the call, on internet evolution, both on the APNet blog, but also on Circle ID, which I think it was quite wide-ranging and quite interesting, just sort of questioning whether Moore's law could continue, whether we still need IP addresses, etc., etc. So definitely worth a read if you have a quiet half hour or so.
Why, thank you. It was a very quick presentation at the Aaron meeting, which was in Texas the week before the IETF. And I was trying to explain the kind of the niche that IPv6 actually filled. And if Moore's law is losing steam, is that still a way forward for the industry? and some musings as to where all this goes if all the innovations behind Moore's law come to a stop, which is highly likely, by the way. Yeah.
Yeah, well, as you pointed out, when you're getting down to 2 nanometers, etc., yeah,
Not much room left.
etc. Yeah, which is quite amazing, to be honest. As I say, plenty of other things, but we don't have time for those. I just wanted to highlight terms of things, deadlines. If you want to put yourself forward for the PIR Advisory Council, you've got till Wednesday for that. And if you want to go to next year's Web Summit in Lisbon, tickets are half price for the next few days at least. And then finally clicked on the wrong thing there, on forthcoming meetings, my good friend Arno twisted my arm, so I'm going to go to the ITU Study Group 17 meeting in a few weeks' time. We're going to have a session on PARSEP, that's our parental controls protocol there, and also in a couple of weeks' time, the European Commission is hosting its high-level group on internet governance. That's a sort of half day, a morning, sort of European time on the 11th of December, which is covering a number of things, including their take on WSIS plus 20 and other stuff. So if you're interested in that, drop me a line. I can share with you what the agenda is if you've not, but you have to register for that, I think, in the next week or so. Okay. So that's it from me. Sorry, we've run out of time. Next week, we're talking about considerations for protective DNS server operators with reference an internet draft on that very topic. So hope that was useful. I'll pull out some of the things from the chat, include them in the notes so they won't be lost. So thank you all for your time, particularly anyone who's unable to sleep on the other side of the world, but I hope you enjoyed the rugby after the last few weeks.
You're being very personal there.
Not to mention that at the end, wouldn't it, really?
Yes. Thanks for doing this, Andrew. Much appreciated.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks.